Welcome to the world premiere of Rob Nagy's Rock and Roll Legacy. For more than 4 decades as a freelance music journalist, I had the honor and the privilege of interviewing countless music icons in rock and roll, jazz, R&B, and blues. It was a priceless journey that began in my late teens. I never imagined I would cross paths with many of my music heroes. Digging deep into my archives, I selected music legend Les Paul to launch what I hope will be a memorable journey for you, the listener, and preserve his legacy for future generations. Heralded for his groundbreaking innovations, the solid body electric guitar, sound-on-sound recording, overdubbing, reverb effects, and echo chambers, not to mention his mastery of the fretboard, music prodigy, guitarist, songwriter, and inventor, Les Paul paved the way for millions of musicians. From the amateur musician to the biggest names in rock and roll, country, jazz, and blues, Les Paul's accomplishments ultimately found him deservedly enshrined in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and the Inventors Hall of Fame. His signature guitar, the Gibson Les Paul, continues to be the instrument of choice for countless guitar legends. Les Paul passed away in 2007 at the age of 94. Gone but not forgotten, Les will be forever remembered for his musical contributions. I had the honor of interviewing Les many times throughout the latter part of his career. You're about to hear an unscripted, never-before-broadcast interview I conducted with Les in 1995 before his performance at Fat Tuesdays in New York City. This is the same venue Les had to convince the manager to give him a stage to perform on in the twilight of his career. Word quickly spread. Les was so revered that he sold out his double headers at Fat Tuesdays for years before moving his legendary Monday night performances to the Iridium, also in New York City. It was common to see a music legend in the audience paying homage to the man and the music. For your listening pleasure, I give you the late Les Paul. I wanted to start with your background, how you got involved in playing music, and what influenced you to get in music initially, years back.
Oh boy, that's a long one. I basically started when I was 9 years old, or maybe a little sooner than that. And I was in my hometown, Waukesha, Wisconsin. And the sewer diggers, on their lunch hour, one of them, after he ate his lunch, started playing the harmonica. And that's the first thing that seemed to draw my attention to the music.
How old were you at that time?
Between 7, 8, and 9, somewhere in there. I don't have a beat on just what time it was.
Right.
But I was very young. And it got me through grade school. And when I found out how to play down dirty blues on the harmonica, it just was the greatest thing that ever happened in Waukesha, both for me and for Waukesha. They really loved it. And so I was making quite a bit of money in those days. And the harmonica was not enough because I would stop and sing and I would play with the harmonica. And so I come in with a drum and I come in with an accordion. I came in with a piano, a saxophone, a banjo. Every one of Mother showed me the wrongs of dragging a drum around, a non-musical instrument, accordion strapped around you and difficult. A piano, you had your back turned to the audience. Even though the piano was the #1 instrument in the world, we whittled it down to the fact that it should be a guitar. And Mom was the one that, she was really a bit with country music anyway. But she didn't like the country music like Gene Autry or any of those people because they were flat-pick guitar players that strummed the thing, and she called them drugstore cowboys. And while she didn't dislike Gene Autry or people of playing that type of music, Roy Rogers and the rest of them, this was much prior. Gene Autry happened to be there, but a lot of the others weren't there. They had people you wouldn't know, the Skillet Lickers, the Gully Jumpers, and on and on and on, the Cumberland Ridge Runners, and just people that very few people today remember. And Mother picked out the bluegrass. So we're dialing West Virginia, and of course, in a very short time it came to WLS in Chicago. And with my harmonica and guitar, I was destined to to practice and fall in love with the guitar and the harmonica and the singing, and took on the name Red Hot Red. Mom gave me that name, Red Hot Red. Later it was changed to Rhubarb Red because I idolized a fellow named Pie Plant Pete. And Pie Plant is rhubarb. And the next thing I know, I'm down at WLS on the National Barn Dance in Chicago. From there, I go with a cowboy band from WLS, from Tronson's Texas Cowboys. And in the meantime, many things began to happen, and I'll just wander right on through. Hi, Gary.
Oh, Lester.
What happened is quite interesting. Is we had a paper route, and the kids and I, and now I don't know, I'm perhaps 10, 11 years old, and somewhere in that period, I saw one of the guys supplementing the papers. The Milwaukee Journal had a green sheet in it, and I'd supplement my papers. He was supplementing his papers, and then we go sling them on the doors without hitting the bay window. and on the mound, he was sitting there winding a coil on an oatmeal box or a toilet roll. And he's so many turns, number 24 wire, and I'm watching him do this, and I'm saying, Harry, what in the world are you doing? He says, I'm building a crystal set. And it was a crystal set that got me into electronics. With the crystal set, I was also playing with my mom's telephone, radio, the player piano, the Victrola. With those instruments, besides the guitar, with those musical devices to play back music, I was terribly intrigued with several things. One, the piano had holes in it, and they were numbers. And I recognized the fact that when you slowed the pitch down, slowed the speed down on a piano, it did not change the pitch. This intrigued me so much because if you did the same thing by putting your hand on a phonograph record, the pitch slowed down, the speed slowed down, and the pitch lowered. This, I said, why the difference between the two? Well, one was digital and one was analog, but I had to go over to the junior high school and all the way to the senior high school, and the science teachers, they took me to the library. And I began to become very interested in electronics and the theory. All of the electronics were coming down on me. And the next thing you know, I said, where should I go where someone can teach me electronics? And I thought of the transmitter that I'm listening to with the crystal set and the radio now. And I says, my goodness, there's the place to go, right to the engineer at the transmitter. And it happened to be a rainy day, and I went out there, took my bicycle, and pumped my way out there, and knocked on the door, and my nose is running, a little red-headed kid, and the guy says, come on in. And I go in there with a fellow Bill at the transmitter, and he says, what's your name? I says, Red. And he says, my name is Bill, what can I do for you? And I says, well, I'd like to ask you some questions about electronics. I says, when a train goes by and it reaches a certain speed, I says, when they're switching going at slow rate, I says, what happens is that the bay window will resonate at a certain frequency, and it disappears when the train goes faster or slower. Just at one speed of that train will vibrate my window. And I can take that window and damp it with my hand and control the resonance. What is the reason for that? And we got involved in resonance and cue. And he began to teach me, and he says, can you come out every Sunday? I'll teach you every Sunday. I did. And right down the road, you could throw a rock at it, was Calhoun. And Calhoun, they were in Brookfield with the TMJ transmitter. In fact, they called me last night, said they're moving the transmitter, and they want to put a little monument there as to where Les Paul studied electronics. And they're going to tear it down, they're going to move it, put an apartment building, and I'll be on the front lawn somewhere with that thing. And anyway, right back of the transmitter was a friend of mine that was to teach me piano every Sunday. So I got 2 lessons every Sunday, electronics and how to play the piano. And of course that was also teaching me music theory and work for the guitar, the harmonica, and everything. And in Waukesha, before long, I was offered a job with this cowboy band at WLS in Chicago. They were playing in my own hometown. Okay, and another very cute thing happened. I happened to be fortunate enough to paste 2 halves of a ticket together and sneak my way into the Auditorium Theater and see Gene Autry. So I sat down there in the front row, and I had my buddy, and his name was Buddy, and oddly enough, he got killed, odd accident, trying to sneak through a window to get into the theater, the same theater, and they found him crushed to death. It was a terribly sad thing to have happen. Anyway, Buddy was holding the flashlight for me, and I had a piece of paper and was charting out where Gene Autry put his fingers, and I was looking for this one particular chord, the 3rd change in Darktown Strutter's Ball. And I couldn't wait for Gene Autry to play that chord. So every time he played that chord, I'd say, hit it. The light would go, flashlight would go on, and we're down in the front row, and I'm putting a dot there so I can get a part of putting that puzzle together for that chord. Gene Autry, the second day, says, he says, something bothers me, but he says, I've done some 8 shows now, and every time I hit this chord, a light goes on in the audience. He says, I'm just curious as to why that is. And so Buddy nudges me, and he says, hey, they're talking about us. And, of course, I stopped writing notes and things down, and Gene says, what's going on down there? And I says, well, sir, I'm trying to find that chord that you're playing. And he says, come on up on the stage. So Gene got me up on the stage, and I says, well, I don't know the name of the chord, but some of the fingering I can tell you. And so he played an F chord, and I says, that's it. And he says, well, here you are. Now you have it. And you and I both can play that chord. And so Gene asked me if I'd want to take his guitar, and he'd like to hear how far I've gotten. And
was that on stage?
This was on stage at the Auditorium Theater.
That must have been a thrill.
Oh, it was a thrill, and the Waukesha people were all out for me, and I'm sure they were very kind, but at the same time, it was only a matter of a couple of years later that I was to audition at a radio station in Chicago and take Gene Autry's place when he moved to California to go into pictures. And that's how ironic things are, that the very fellow that taught me that I should be taking his place at a radio station. And another guy that sat in the very lobby that very same day was Pie Plant Pete, the fellow that I named myself after. Pie Plant Pete, I loved the way he sang and played the harmonica and guitar. And here I am sitting across from him in the same room, auditioned for the job, and I got the job. And he didn't. And I came out after they hired me, and I says, Pete, I'm so sorry. And he says, son, that's life. He says, you're going to have to get used to that. And I'm sure the day will come when you'll be sitting in the hallway and in the lobby, and it'll be the reverse. The other guy that studied from you will probably get the job, or your mentor, whoever.
Of course, that never happened.
Well, many things happen. Life is full of surprises, and nothing ever goes easy. There's ups and downs, there's pluses and minuses, and when it goes like that in this kind of life, I've enjoyed every bit of it, the ups and downs, and it's always been to my advantage on a down. Like if I'm lying in a hospital, I say, well, I'm stuck here in the hospital, so I'll invent the synthesizer. I will write some songs that prove to be very beneficial. I will develop a whole new idea for a solid body guitar. There's so many things that happen when something that should be a tragedy is a rather nice tragedy when it's over. At the time, everybody is saying, and of course it is, it's a terrible thing to be in an accident or have both ears perforated, and you have to have surgery on both of your ears. It's not nice when you get an electric shock and you're out of commission for a year's time. I've had so many things happen to me, and they could be very bad. They could be very depressing and a downer. I guess I was thinking of what Norman Vincent Peale wrote. I guess I always thought that way. The power of positive thinking, I just had it automatically in me. That no matter how low things were, how depressed things were, how down things were, the rough was only mental, and there's a good side to a bad side or a bad situation. So I was the type of person that loved challenges and loved people. And so it was a rather easy thing for me to go into the business and succeed. But there was many drawbacks. There's many times when I left home, when I'm 13 years old when I left home, 14, 15. I remember in 1930 being on a Sunday afternoon sitting on a newsstand in St. Louis, Missouri, and all my friends who were grown men had girlfriends, and they were out having a ball. They were out having a good time and getting drunk and everything, and I'm a 14-year-old kid that's letting my feet dangle on one of those newsstands that was closed on a Sunday, crying because I miss my mom, I miss home, I miss my kids to go play with. I was not to have all the advantages that a kid has in growing up, where I could be with other kids and hockey and ski, and I did a lot of it. But at 14, I was whisked away from that and deep into electronics and deep into music, and was dedicated to it. And consequently, I just missed an awful lot of being with kids my own age and finishing school.
Now they're coming to see you perform. I think you got the last laugh.
Yeah, it was a wonderful thing. And another thing I can tell you is that I started out as a country player in country music. My mom, with the guidance of Mom, because she was a lover of that kind of music. But soon I was to be surrounded by some terribly important people. When I got to Chicago, I happened to have the pleasure of working with Louis Armstrong and Roy Eldridge and Earl Hines and Coleman Hawkins and Art Tatum and Eddie South, the Dark Angel of the violin, Teddy Wilson, and Amos and Andy. And here I am just thrust among the great people. And so I automatically says, what's this? This music I like better than country music. It was more of a challenge to me, and to play with Earl Hines and Coleman Hawkins, and at that time Lawrence Welk was just a youngster coming through, and I had the pleasure of working with all these people. And then I had to make a decision. And the first decision I made, I'm now on radio in Chicago, musical director, some 15, 16, 17 years old, and I'm telling grown people what to play and what to do, and I'm a musical director of a radio station, several of them. At that young age, and here I am making a decision as to whether I want to be a country player or a pop player or a jazz player. And I looked at this thing last night. It crossed my mind. I turned a tape machine on, and for a movie that they're going to make of my life, it happened to be very interesting that I should, for the first time, look at my life and say, who in the world ever had the opportunities that I had? To work at WLS in Chicago, I was working with people like Grace Wilson, the Maple City Four, Red Foley, Gene Autry, the Cumberland Ridge Runners, Doc Hopkins, Lula Bellascotti, the Arkansas Woodchopper, Bradley Kincaid. I was working with the absolute cream of the crop, Pat Buttram. The people that I learned from in country was staggering, was 50 different acts. Now I'm working with Sam and Henry before they changed their name to Amos and Andy. I am working with Fibber McGee and Molly when they were starting out. I had the pleasure of doing the first soap operas. I had the pleasure of playing in both worlds with the Earl Hines and the Teddy Wilsons, the Nat Coles. All of this in Chicago at the same time. Nobody had this if they lived to be a million. And this was amateur night because I was to pack my car up and in 1937 flip a coin, and I had a trio. And with my trio, I'm heading for New York City. It come down heads, New York, here we come. And I had Jimmy Atkins, Chet Atkins' half-brother, and Ernie Newton, bass player, and myself. And we're heading for New York for the big time. When we get to New York, 52nd Street was something to behold. From the Hickory House with Joe Marcella, the next thing I see is Slim and Slam Stewart. Next to that, I see Art Tatum. Next to that, I see Roy Eldridge. Next to that is Count Basie. Next to that and next to that is Mildred Bailey, Billie Holiday, and on and on and on with all the greatest saxophone players in the world. Now I'm talking about Coleman Hawkins, Ben Webster, I'm talking about every Lester Young, all the greatest guitar players. Dizzy Gillespie wasn't here yet. Okay, and many of the others hadn't arrived in New York yet. And here I am seeing all of this and walk into the middle of it, and they open with open arms. They say, "Come on in, Les. My name is now Les Paul." I changed my name because in Chicago I had two names, Rhubarb Red as a country player and Les Paul as a jazz player. So at night, I played all night with the jazz guys, went up and did my hillbilly show, and I slept like a dog or a cat. I slept whenever there was nothing happening. Jacques, I went to sleep. They wake me up and I'd go, sometimes I wouldn't know if I'm playing jazz or playing country. And when I got to New York, in no time at all, it's a long story, but I'll try to minimize it as much as I can, condense it down for you. I had told the guys when we were heading for New York, guys in my trio says, "Hey, Les, who are you going to contact in New York? You know everybody." And I says, my good friend Paul Whiteman. Well, I'd never met Paul Whiteman, but I wasn't going to punch a hole in this balloon. These fellows are all gung-ho to go to New York with me, and I had to tell a little white lie. So when we got to New York, they just said, are you going to call your buddy? And I said, sure. So I called on the phone, and they quickly said they're not interested. And I hung up, and Ernie and Jim says, what did they say? And I says, they told me to come right over. So come on, guys, we're heading for it. So at 53rd and Broadway, we go up there, and the door was slammed immediately in our face. And here we are out in the hallway. And of all things that have happened, Fred Waring is stepping out of the Paul Whiteman's bathroom because they're redoing his bathroom and kitchen. And he's rehearsing 62 Pennsylvanians on the next floor below. And we're standing in the hallway, rejected by Paul Whiteman. They just closed the door. And I says, aren't you Mr. Whiteman, Mr. Waring? And he said to me, look, I've got 62 Pennsylvanians I can't feed now. I'm not interested in you hillbillies. Okay? And so I said, Fred, is it possible that we could play until the elevator gets here? And he says, I don't think there's a law that'll stop you. And I says, okay. And we started to play. When the elevator got up, he says, get in. And we got in, he got in with us, and we're going down to the next floor, got out and followed Fred. Fred says, follow me. We went in, 62 Pennsylvanians in this big, enormous room. And he says, stop it. So everybody stopped it. He says, I had the most unusual thing happen. But he says, this Mozart string trio nailed me in a hallway. And I said, pardon me, but it's the Ozark string trio, right? It got a laugh right away. And he laughed, and he says, well, I'd like to have them play a number for you, and if you like them as much as I do, I'm going to hire them. And I said to the other two guys, we got the job. I says, I know it. I know we got the job.
What a great story.
And Fred says, go ahead. And here I am, the first one in New York with an electric guitar. And here I am with this, I call it my toaster, because I've been playing the electric guitar since 1929. So here I am with electric guitar, and that's a whole story of its own. And Fred Waring says, well, you're hired. Right then, there on the spot. And that's how we got into New York. And for the next 5 years, we were the very fortunate ones to be 5 times a night, 5 times a week, you know, not twice a night, 5 times a week, coast to coast with Fred Waring. And featured, you know, with the Les Paul Trio. So we were very, very lucky people. Yeah. I'll be up there. Make mine the chicken pie. Okay, with soup and salad. Thank you.
So from that point on, there was no looking back.
Oh, there was looking back. There was all kinds of things, because I got a call from the radio station in Chicago where I previously was before I came to New York, and they offered me an enormous salary to be musical director of the stations and to join Ben Burney, who had 5 days a week for Wrigley Gum. And in that way, I could be making more than 2 or 3 times the money I ever made. And I had already made up my mind to go with Bing Crosby. In fact, I'd already knocked on Fred Waring's door, and I said, Fred, I'm leaving. And he says, uh-oh. He says, I'm going to lose my guitar player. He says, I said, yeah. And he says, where are you going? I said, I'm going with Bing Crosby. And he says, I knew one of these guys would grab you. He says, how did that happen? I says, it didn't happen yet. I says, I've never met Bing, but I says, I'm going to meet him. I says, I'm on my way to go out there, and I says, I'm determined I will be, I'm sure I'll be with Bing Crosby. But fate would have it that I would go to Chicago, and for almost a year I stayed in Chicago and was musical director of 2 stations and working with Ben Burney. Ben Burney said, I am not well and I wish to retire. And he says, I would like to hire you now to take my place and take my orchestra and front it. And you become the Ben Burney with your name Les Paul. I'll start paying you as of now. I'll take you to California and you will, so things changed. Where I thought I was going with Crosby, I ended up with Ben Burney, and $75 a week with no work, but just to go train and lead a band and play my guitar and be a personality and take on Walter Winchell and all the things that happened with Ben Burney. Well, I got to California. I drove out there with my trio, and Ben Burney is dying. And he's at Ida Lupino's house. When I saw him, of course, it was very tragic, but the man was very ill and dying. And so I says, well, that's life. I got to go on. And now, Bing Crosby. And so with my trio, I had a piano player and a bass player I picked up in California, an old ex-bass player, and we were ready to approach Bing Crosby. The first day I was there, I knew I'd go over to Decca Records because my old friend Jack Kapp was there, the president of Decca Records. When I walked in the door, he says, well, Red, what are you doing out here? And I says, I came out to see what's happening. And he says, would you like to be musical director of Decca Recording in Hollywood? That meant that I would pick the musicians for Bing Crosby and everybody else. It was a wonderful break. I was only there a couple hours. And lo and behold, the phone, someone called on the phone and got a hang of Perry Bodkin, and Perry Bodkin was the #1 guitar player in California. And he was there. And he says, Les Paul. I said, yeah, he says, my name's Perry Bodkin. Of course, I'd heard of Perry Bodkin, and I knew that he was the biggest guitar player out in California. And so he said to me, I'll give you half of my book. I'll give you half the shows that I have, the work that I have. And it was Spike Jones, and it was Johnny Mercer, and it's Al, whatever his name was, I hope, and on and on and on. Tremendous amount of shows. And he says, I says, no, I'm not interested, Perry. And he says, well, I don't want us to be in competition. He says, I know how powerful you are, da-da-da. And he says, I have this in my back pocket. So if I give you half my shows, why, then we won't be in competition. We can work it out. And I says, well, what I want to do, well, he says, what do you want to do? What do you want to do, and I'll help you get it. I says, well, first of all, I want to go with Bing Crosby. Well, his face dropped because he says, I'm with Bing Crosby. And I don't want you with Bing Crosby. I says, well, no matter what you want, that's where I'm going. I'm going with Bing. And he says, what about Decca here? And I said, I'm not interested in Decca. And he breathed a sigh of relief because he was musical director. They wanted to get him out. And so I says, no, I says, I'm not looking for any job or anything that you might have, Perry. I play solo guitar. I don't want to sit in a band, so all the jobs you got, I'm not interested in. I don't want to be musical director of Decca, so you can just relax. He says, what about Crosby? You want me to talk to him? No, I says, I'll talk to him. And so I says, just believe me, I will be playing solos, and you'll still be with Bing Crosby. We can work together, and there'll be no problem. And so I watched what was happening, and at 5 o'clock every Thursday, Bing Crosby and the crew would break. They would have a coffee break at 5 o'clock. It was just before showtime, a couple hours before showtime. They'd break and go out and eat. Others would go across the street and get a few shots in them and whatever at their local saloon there. And so when I saw what was happening from the parking lot, I was parked right next to Bing's car. And we were getting closer to Bing. So I says to the two guys, I says, we got to get inside of NBC. And so I figured a way out. I says, when you walk up to the people leaving past the guard at the artist entrance, I'll get in first. And when I get in with this mess of people coming out, I will yell at you that you forgot your music. And you with your bass squeeze your way back in. Okay, so we're starting from the outside going in. The three of us got in. We're looking at the hallway and we're looking at beautiful NBC in Hollywood. And we immediately, I said, here's a room. And it was F, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and that's the way it went. So Studio F we went into, and there was no one in there, and we set it up. We set our instruments up. And here we are with the electric guitar and the bass player and the piano player. We started to play Back Home Again in Indiana. And we started to play this thing, and a little guy come in with a book in his hand, a writing pad, you know, and it's on that clipboard. And he says, what's the name of this group? I says, we sneaked in because I says, we don't know any other way of doing this thing. We got to be heard. And he says, well, play something. We played the number, and he says, stay right here. I says, we're in no hurry to leave. and he ran down the hallway. He introduced himself. He says, my name is Billy Gilcher. I'm a contractor for NBC. He says, I'm going to get the musical director. And he brought Tom Pelusi back, and Tom Peluso listened, and he says, you guys are hired. And we were staff on NBC right then and there. Now, when we were at NBC, I could watch Crosby, and Crosby'd come out of Studio B, and he'd casually wander down to E. And E was the emergency room. And the emergency room was in case of air raids, and they had some canned food in there, a piano and a mic and a record player, and an engineer and a light for on the air, and that was it. That was a small room. So I told the girl upstairs what room I'd like to rehearse in. If it was vacant, we had it. And if it didn't have a show going on, there's a lot of rooms there. I says, I'd like E. And she says, nobody ever uses that room. E, that's an emergency room. It's very small. You wouldn't want that room. I says, we want something real intimate. And I knew, you know, that a little after 5, Bing was going to walk in. So I didn't tell the other two guys in my trio because they'd be scared to death. And so a couple minutes after 5, we set up in that room, and we're playing Back Home Again in Indiana as fast as we can play it, and we're just tearing our brains apart. And the door opened. And when the door opened, they stopped playing, and it was Bing, and he said, excuse me, I didn't know anyone was here. And he left, turned around, walked out, double doors closed, you know, airtight. And they said, that's Bing Crosby. I says, keep playing. But they says, that's Bing. I says, keep playing. So they went back and played, and we're going along, and the door reopened. And Bing says, may I? I says, sure. So Bing leaned over the piano and listened. He says, hold it. And he says, what's the name of this group? I says, the Les Paul Trio. And he says, of course, you're Les Paul. I says, yes, sir. He says, where do you work? I says, right here at NBC. He says, you don't anymore. He says, you're working for me now, starting next Thursday. And so Bing turns around and he leaves. He says, you guys are great. And he turned around, he's walking. He only got a few feet. And I hollered, hey, Bing. And he didn't even turn around. He says, yeah, Les. And I says, how much? He says, 1 thou. And he partially turned around so I could hear him. 1 thou, and he waved goodbye, and he's walking toward his studio. And I hollered again, hey, Bing. And he says, "What now?" And I says, "How much for the other two guys?"
That's great.
And so we were with Bing Crosby.
And how long did that? How long were you with Bing?
I was with Bing until the Army gave me my induction papers, and I was going into the service. I got a call from Connecticut from Glenn Miller, and Glenn Miller said, "I would like to request you to be with my band." And I was terribly honored to go with Glenn Miller. I had a home, so when I know that I'm inducted, I'm making a movie now with Eleanor Powell, Sensations of 44. And we're in that movie. I'm in another movie, and this one is over at Paramount, and things are breaking for us. It's a shame that the service called on us, but I says I'm going with Glenn Miller, and that's going to be a great experience for me. And a fellow, his mother died, he said to me, "Would you play rhythm guitar for me?" It's just a thing where you play straight rhythm guitar. And it was with Gordon Jenkins Orchestra. And I says, "Okay, I'll do that for you." And it's something I don't usually do, is play rhythm guitar in a band, but in this case I did. And at rehearsal there was hardly anything to do, and so in a minute we were busy jamming, and we're tearing the place apart on a break, you know. Gordon Jenkins is enjoying it. All of a sudden a big fella come up to me, and it was Meredith Willson, and he says, "What might your name be?" And I says, "It's Les Paul." "Oh," he says, "you were with Fred Waring? You're the guy with Fred Waring, the guitar player with Fred?" I says, "I was. I'm out here now." "Well," he says, "if ever you get drafted, we are starting the Armed Force Radio service here in Hollywood, and I'd love to have you in my orchestra." I says, "I've already been drafted." And I says, I already requested by Glenn Miller. He says, "I will squelch that." He says, "I'll knock that one out, and would you like to be with me?" Oh, I said, "I'd love to be with you." And so there's a long story about me in the Army, very funny story, but I'll just tell that another time. I ended up with Meredith Willson on the same street I lived, downhill 2 blocks. So I lived at Sunset and Gordon, and they were at Santa Monica and Gordon. So I'd kick the brake off in my car, and I wouldn't even have to turn it on. I'd coast to work. And the guys in the Army, they would say, and they were big. Bill Morrow was a writer for many of the top shows, and Bob Welch. And the Armed Forces was the biggest thing in the service, in entertainment. Everybody knows about it. And the people I had the pleasure of working there made Chicago and New York look like amateur night. Now I'm with Jimmy Stewart, I'm with James Cagney, I'm with Amos Nandy, I'm with Fibber McGee and Molly, I'm with Jack Benny, I'm with everybody in this world. Lionel Hampton, the Artie Shaws, the Benny Goodmans, all. And so I had the pleasure of working. There was Orson Welles and Kate Smith, and my trio. I either was in the band, playing in the band, and met them, and watched them, or I was working with Dinah Shore, and I was working with the Mills Brothers, I was working with the Ink Spots, I was working with Nat Cole, I was working with any person in this world that you can name at that time.
Did you realize at the time the magnitude of the people you were working with,
Oh,
did
yeah.
it take years later for you to
Oh
look
no,
back
no,
on
no! I knew Tallulah Bankhead, and I knew all these people. I knew how fortunate I was to get drunk with Edward G. Robinson and Jimmy Stewart, Bing Crosby, Joe Venuti, Eddie Duchin, and myself marching down the street to go to church one Sunday morning, drunker than a skunk.
And this is all as a young man, too.
Yeah, yeah, we were all young, and we were drunk and going to church, and the police stopped us in Bel Air, and when they saw this immense crowd of guys walking down the street bombed, they had to be very careful about how they were going to turn us around and send us back to the house, right? And it was wonderful that I had all the names. I still have them home. In fact, the last time I saw George Burns, I worked 2 years with George Burns after the service. And George heard me in the service, and he says, "When you get out, you're with me."
So everybody said that too.
Yeah, that's right. Rudy Valley and Crosby, all of them. I went with all of them. So you talk about the three things. You have to love your work. You have to be in love. You have to believe in God. Yeah, you have to be terribly lucky, and you have to be. If you're an atheist, okay, you have to be somehow given all this talent. And not that I had the talent, I meant that this is necessary. Talent is necessary. You don't go down to the store and buy rhythm. You don't go down to the store and buy a sense of humor. You don't go down to the store and buy perfect pitch. There's so many things. And soul, you just don't buy. And again, I had the pleasure of working with guys like Ray Charles, and when you think of people like Ray Charles, okay, who is a very dear friend of mine, the reason I mentioned him, I heard him last night, and I heard the original record of Georgia.
It's a great song.
And that is the greatest. He pours his heart out in that thing, and believe me, people ask why I tape and videotape and why I record the shows every week here at Fat Tuesdays. And I can tell you very simply that I am constantly aware that if you get off of the track and you start playing like a machine, if the machine is telling you what to do, if you're not communicating with your audience, if you're not playing the right notes in the right place, the people that should be crying when you play Over the Rainbow, they're talking to someone else. But when you play when I do Over the Rainbow and I see these people crying, then I know I'm doing what I should be doing and playing the guitar. And when I make them happy and laugh, then I'm doing my job. Okay? And when that don't happen, when that doesn't happen, I immediately am aware and go home, look at the tapes, and see where my errors are. It's in timing, it's in playing. You know, one note fascinates the hell out of me, because you can take that one note, you can play it soft, you can play it loud, you can play it this way, you can pick it here, you can pick it there. And how can you take these notes and put them together? And it becomes the most soulful thing. It becomes like Ray Charles was with Georgia. Now I'm telling you, when I found Ray Charles and I found him, and I went up to Mitch Miller and I said, "Hey Mitch, I found a guy and I'm telling you, he's the greatest." And I played him. He says, "You call that guy a singer?" And he was turned down completely. Okay. And it doesn't mean anything to me, because Mitch is a great musician. He's a great talent. Some do and some don't. I don't know how many people turned me down with my ideas of the synthesizer and multi-track recording. When I invented the electric guitar, I never had so much opposition. Get rid of that toaster. Get rid of it. When I was back with Fred Waring, it got to a point where the four of us after the show, I did the first show. We do 2 shows a night, one for the East Coast, one for the West Coast. Did one with the straight guitar and one with the electric guitar. And Waring says, "What are you doing with the straight guitar?" And I says, "Well, I'm receiving more mail than you are." And he says, "I know that." "And why?" And I says, "Because people are arguing over whether I should play the electric guitar or the straight guitar. And so we tromped over to 53rd and Broadway, right above the Letterman Theater. And I did many a broadcast out of that theater, okay, long before Sullivan. And what happened was that the four of us voted unanimously the electric guitar. And of course, I've never regretted the electric guitar because that's the way to go. And the guitar wouldn't be #1 today unless it was electric. And of course, the electric guitar was accepted by the public, but it wasn't accepted by my fellow musicians and some of the critics that said, no, it must be acoustical and all of that. They're purists out there. And so we had battles. We always had someone that put their foot out and tripped us. But when I was with Bing Crosby, they used to say, don't hire that act, get some white boys. They thought I was black. And they didn't want black guys, they wanted white guys. And we were white. But we played black because I grew up listening to black people and any chance I got. And now I'll go back to New York with Fred Waring. And Fred said to me, he says, you know, you get fined by the union more times than any person I ever saw. He says, why are you always up in Harlem and why are you caught jamming? I says, Fred, that's where I'm learning to play that guitar. I says, the white man has to learn from the black man. He's the guy that's got it. And of course, I'm up there with Art Tatum, and I'm up there with John Kirby, and I'm up there with Guts, and I'm up there with Joe Jones. This is before Buddy Rich, okay? Although Buddy Rich, oddly enough, and I might bring his name up because he's a very, very great drummer. He was at the Capitol Theater with Artie Shaw and Mel Torme, and we were at the Strand Theater with Fred Waring. And this is my first time in 1937 that I'm on Broadway. And on Broadway with Fred Waring, who, by the way, was anti-record. So he had a whole group of people, and they were fighting the record industry, and that the record was going to put us out of business eventually. And so he got Paul Whiteman, Tommy Dorsey, and everybody to form a pact not to make a phonograph record. Well, to me, that was a stupid idea. And Fred knew that I disagreed with him. And anyway, we're on the stage at the Strand. And Buddy is over at the Capitol Theater. And on our break between shows, we'd meet at a deli. And that's how I got to know Buddy Rich, and we were to pal around together. And Buddy, for instance, we'd go over to Music City, over to the Rockefeller Center, to the music hall, and we'd sit up in the balcony. And he had a pair of binoculars, and we used to look at the pit drummer. And he used to say to me, "Here, take these glasses and tell me what that drummer's doing." So I'd listen. He says, watch for that closed roll. Now, are his elbows close to his sides, or does he lift them out, you know? And they were just little secrets that the drummer had, just technique. And this drummer played very, very fine drums. He was a pit drummer, okay? And so many things are learned from others, and I remember, where did Buddy learn from? And that's one of the things that we learned. Another thing we learned is that Fred says, I'm going to feature you at the Strand Theater. He says, how do you want to be presented? So I didn't think about it. I just says, well, why don't you just introduce us? Just say you have the Les Paul Trio here, and we'll come out and we'll do the rest. He says, okay. Well, we came out and we died. And so I went to the dressing room and I knocked, and he says, come on in, Les. And I said, oh, you knew it was me? He says, oh, yeah, I know it was you. He says, now you want to know why you didn't go over, huh? And I says, yeah. He says, well, I'll tell you. If there's 65 Pennsylvanians on that stage, and I'm going to bring someone off from the side, he better be the biggest thing in the world. to knock off 65 Pennsylvanians. And you three guys are going to come out. He says, if you want to do it right, you come out of the band. So you hold your instrument and you're in the orchestra. And then I will call you. And if you knock over a couple of music stands, so much the better. So he says, be clumsy, come out of the band, and you'll stop the show. And we did. Okay.
That's great.
And from that, we got a record contract with Columbia Records, OK Records. And I went to Fred, and I said, Fred, I want to make a record. He says, you know my feelings about that. And I said, I know yours, and you know mine. I said, we're going to make a record, right? He says, OK. And so we made our first record, and it was picked by Billboard that it had great possibilities. And so that was the beginning of Broadway, Fred Waring, and sorry I left Crosby out there, but and the Army.
What question did we ask?
Oh, I don't know what you asked.
No, I know. I remember the last time we had interviewed you, we asked you a question. I think we got a 20-minute interview out of
Sure,
question,
sure.
which is great.
Well, I think it's faster than going the other way.
Absolutely. Well, you're a great interviewer.
Fred Waring and the Pennsylvanians recorded my favorite Christmas album of all time, and it's long out of print. I guess it was from the early 50s, but sensational. They had all the choirs, and they ran through the whole gamut of musical styles.
If I may, I'll tell you what happened there. What happened there was a very interesting thing because the president of Capitol Records had come out with the drawings of the round building, and he wanted to know what should be done that I might be able to add in electronics or ideas about the round building. And so he and his wife Dorothy were there, and we finished with the round building and everything, and rolled up the stuff, put it in that scroll container, and we're heading down Route 17 to New York. We only got a few miles from our home in Mahwah, and the president, Glenn Wallach, said from the back seat, he says, oh, I meant to tell you, he says, I got a chance to pick up Sinatra, but he says, I turned him down. And this is the time when Sinatra was a disc jockey in New York and was at his bottom, the bottom of his career.
That was before Tommy Dorsey?
No, this is after. This is after he was already up there and fell down. He crashed. He was in love with the gal over in Spain. And I did his show. He gave me a watch and Mary a watch and so forth to do the show. He had an hour show.
How you doing?
Hey, great. How you doing?
Peter will be here later. My wife Patty.
Hi. How you doing? We're doing an interview, and I'll get to you as soon as I can. Okay. All right. Thank you. Yeah, it's okay. How you doing? And so let's see. Oh, so, he turned Sinatra down. And when he said that, I turned the car around. Mary said, did you forget something? I says, yeah, I did. And we drove back to the house. When we got to the house, I says, Glenn, it's this simple. Don't ever bet against a champion. Now, I says, pick up the phone, call Sinatra, and sign him up. Capitol. He did. And I says, now, do you want Bing Crosby? I says, I'm sure he's available. I called California. They said he was with Grace Kelly. I called over there, and not only got Bing for Capitol, but I got Grace Kelly. I got them both, and Fred Waring. Then I said to him, what about the Andrews sisters? Would you like to get them? And I picked up the phone. Now I got Fred Waring, Sinatra, Grace Kelly, the Andrews sisters. Okay, I says, what about the Mills brothers? And I went down a list of all the friends I knew, and I built a stable for Capitol Records. It's unbelievable.
Wow, that is impressive.
So I happen to know the people from the Army days and everything, and it paid off, really paid off.
That's phenomenal.
Yeah. Yeah, that's how Fred Waring did his Christmas album, and he was the guy. Fred Waring was the person to come to me when I lived in Stroudsburg, when we were on tour in the East. And I says, well, let's stay somewhere near Bing. And so we found a place for a winter. in Stroudsburg, and next to me was Don Amici. He was my neighbor next door. And Mary and I are there, and we're recording and doing our thing. And Fred Waring came to me and he says, Les, I want you to have dinner with me and tell me what I'm doing wrong. Okay. And Fred was having a tough time at that time. And we went to dinner, and the answer was very simple. Remain small. 65 Pennsylvanians. And I says, Fred, one guy can come out with a cowboy outfit on and knock you out of the box. I says, what do you need 65 people for? I says, you don't need them. I says, I have 4 people. My brother-in-law, Mary's sister, Mary, and myself. And the manager doesn't go with us. That's 4 people, got a manager and got an accountant. That's 6 people. It ends there. He's got 106. So Fred says, well, what should I do? And I says, you know that guy that's on TV now, he's just starting out. And I says, the toast of the town guy, what the hell's his name? Oh, he says, the reporter, the writer, Sullivan, Ed Sullivan. I says, yeah. I says, that guy goes out and hires the talent. And I says, you copy the talent. You got your 65 people to do an imitation of the original. I says, he's a finger pointer. All he does is point to the actor, and they come out on the stage and they got the real thing. I says, Fred, the secret is get the real thing. And I says, and then you're not lugging out 4 train loads of people. Yeah. Okay, with Fred. I don't think he ever did it. He did get smaller though, but not for the same.
It's a heavy payroll to carry around.
It sure was.
Brutal.
Yeah.
So you got involved then in the 50s. You got involved in doing the track recording.
Well, then I invented. I had a recording studio. That came when Bing Crosby and I were making a recording, and Bing says we were eating breakfast, and he says you didn't seem too enthusiastic when Jack Cap said that's a hit. And he says, I agreed with it, but he says, there was no reaction from you. How come? And I'm having a salami sandwich and a beer with Bing at the Grotto. And 8 o'clock in the morning. And Bing says, why? And I says, well, they could have made the recording so much better, electronically. And he says, you know, I've listened to your stuff. And he says, I've been to your home. I'm telling you this. Bing had been to our home and everything else. He was very into what I was doing. So Bing says, get in the car. He drove down Sunset Boulevard and he said, I'm going to pick a place out for you and call it the Les Paul House of Sound. He says, I believe in you and that's what you should do. And I says, Bing, I don't want to do that kind of stuff. I says, I want to just play my guitar. I got enough things to do. He says, okay. He took me back to my car, and we forgot about it. But when I got home, I told my 2 buddies about it. My 2 buddies says, I think you made a mistake. You should have done it, taken Bing up. I says, well, I didn't. And they says, well, why don't you just take your garage and turn it into a studio? We did. And Vern guided me with the electronics, and Lloyd guided me with building the studio with a saw and a hammer, and we built that thing. And in that studio, okay, I did a favor for Crosby. I turned him on to a tape machine that I found here in Orange, New Jersey. And a fellow contacted me and asked me if I'd come over and look at it, that they had confiscated it from the Germans. And it was called a magnetophone. And I looked at that thing, and I said to Bing, I said, Bing, that's the way to go. You can be on the golf course and the whole darn thing. I says, it's a tape machine. To make a long story short, Ampex started to make the tape machines. Crosby loaned him the money. And he was deeply, he appreciated it, that I had led him onto the machine. So he brought over to my home. He says, I have a present for you. It's out in my car. So I figured either a world's largest amount of Kraft cheese in his trunk, or I was going to get a humongous Philco radio. And to my surprise, it was neither. It was one of the early tape machines. And he and I carried it in the backyard. And within an hour, I said to Mary, I come screaming in. I said, I've figured a way to make sound on sound. We don't need the garage anymore. I now know how to make a recording where I can make as many Marys and as many Lesses I want to. And I don't have to have discs, and I can do it all with one tape machine. And Mary says, but what if it doesn't work? And she kept that up all the way to Chicago saying, but what if it doesn't work? Till I was scared to death. And I had to call Ampex and tell them, hey, I blew a head. I need an extra head. And so they sent it to me in Chicago. And I got out of the yellow pages. I got a guy with a drill. He drilled a hole in there. And then we looked underneath to see if we hit anything, right? And the darn thing ran. And I says, 1, 2, 3, 4, testing, hello, hello, hello. And it came back, howdy, hello, and the whole thing, and it worked. And I said, see, Mary, I knew it was going to work. I was scared to death it wouldn't work either, you know. And so the sound on sound, the multi-track was invented on tape. I'd already discovered reverb. I already got phase shifting. I'd already invented the guitar and the electronic bass. So I had all those things under my belt, the synthesizer. And I was deep into piezo's with acoustic electrics. I was deep into that from 1941 when I first went to California. And when I got drafted and went with Meredith Willson, in walked the people from the Navy, and they said, we're looking for a musician with a great ear and smart in electronics. And Meredith says, see that guy with the guitar over there? That's the guy you're looking for. He's got an ear, you bump against something, he can play it. He says, get that guy. And he says, and he knows electronics. And what they wanted is to fool the enemy by building a subterfuge box and sink it in the water and have the enemy chase a box, okay? And so I'm in a diving bell, a couple of 100 miles offshore in the Pacific Ocean, helping them design the subterfuge box for the Navy. So I had quite an experience in my lifetime, yeah.
Do you consider yourself to be a musician first or an engineer first?
No, they're interwoven. I probably spend 99% of my time. I never practice, which anybody can tell, but I spend the majority of my time designing, engineering, and tinkering with electronics and hanging around people that really know electronics. And today especially, I picked up the book last night, the magazines that come in, whether it's TV news, broadcast news, or mixed magazine, whatever it is. And I look at it and it's staggering as to how fast they've taken the things that I've invented and the things that are out there now. And they were little toys. They're no longer little toys. They're using them to get to the moon. They're doing brain surgery. The thing is taken off where it's no longer simple little things. Okay? And one of the greatest kicks came to me yesterday. The Edison's museum called me and the curator asked if I would be willing to go over there and record on Edison's original machine to do with the cylinder in the same room and do the same thing as Edison done so that I can be the one to continue where he left off. And I says, I am so honored. It's unbelievable.
I think that's got to be,
Yeah.
would be incredible.
Yeah, it's quite a trip. The whole life has been quite a trip for me. So when I close my eyes, I'll tell you, I didn't miss anything that I know of.
You lived a couple lives.
A lot of lives, yeah. And I enjoyed every bit of it. I happen to be fortunate enough to find someone as talented as Mary and have someone as talented as my mom, because they happen to be two people that surely helped me get where I'm at. And there's a million people that I owe so much to that were also involved in me discovering, inventing, creating, and getting where I am. They believed in me and made it possible. Cannot work alone. you go nowhere.
To have the opportunity to sit with the great Les Paul was extraordinary. His humble, unguarded, honest, kind, and passionate nature impressed me. He genuinely wanted to know as much about me and my story as I want to know about him. He left a memorable impression on me, and I'm sure anyone lucky enough to engage with this iconic man. Thank you for taking a walk with me down memory lane. I look forward to our time together next week when I present an interview I conducted in 1995 with blues legend B.B. King. Until next time, peace, serenity, and blessings.